I'm Ian Nicol. I'm representing, in this case, a little organisation, not-for-profit company in the UK called Handi-Hopd. And we're talking about this Handi-Hopd thing, which stands for the Handy Open Platform Demonstrator, and some of it will gel very nicely with what you've heard the rest of the day. A little bit about Handi-Hopd. It's a not-for-profit, what it calls in the UK a community enterprise company. And the idea was to take advantage of what I think we all recognise, the mobile apps revolution. The idea that big Leviathan systems are probably on their way out. Epic might disagree with us, but I suspect they're at the high water mark. And what we're starting to see is a whole lot of small-scale developers trying to do little applications that, if we're not careful, will just become little siloed applications. But we're there trying to support developers, health and care professionals, patient service users of care. So we define apps as little lightweight digital tools. So not necessarily something that just lives on a mobile. Okay, it could be on a desktop. We've got lots and lots of examples of desktop apps. I've got one called Toggle, which is just to monitor my time usage. So it's a connected thing. Okay, it has to plug into a greater infrastructure in order for it to give any real value. Should be built according to a well-developed framework, and crucially an order of magnitude faster and cheaper to develop than those big systems. Also, an order of magnitude faster to fail, because how often have we, I suspect all of us, been involved in large-scale projects that very quickly people know are going wrong, but you're too committed. Everybody's spent too much time, effort, intellectual capital and reputation that you've just got to keep it going. One of the benefits of these little apps, of getting this into a more granular environment, is that we can afford to let things fail. Move on, just go on to the next one, ditch that. That's the philosophy. Now, clearly this kind of environment, or way of working, has to live within an ecosystem. It can't just, these things cannot survive on their own. So we've got the idea of a bunch of apps, and then we've got hopefully some open source components that people can use in common. This is UK, but it probably translates reasonably well. Integration components, national infrastructure. So the spine is the national NHS demographics infrastructure. Things like terminology services, clinical knowledge pathways. API messaging content based on open source clinical content definitions. I think however you regard the open or closed source environment, this kind of knowledge has to be in common, has to be open source. I don't think it's no longer, to me, controversial. But then I think you definitely want down at this layer and at that layer a whole bunch of competing vendors, a whole bunch of competing technologies, and same at the top. You don't want to lock this down. I don't think you want to lock it down into open or closed source business models either. I think the market can decide what it wants in this space. So, obviously coming from an OpenEHR world, I would think, archetypes are the way to get this clinically led, collaboratively authored, open source, crowdsourced methodology with a shared open source repository with an open source license. But most importantly, the agility to respond continually to changing demand. Clinical ideas change all the time. Even things that you think are locked down and static, like medications, for instance, change, or at least new requirements emerge. I'm not sure that it's necessarily the medical truths are any different, but clinicians keep coming out with new tweaks on the same thing. That needs clear ownership, a very clear change request mechanism, so that things can be put into the change request and maybe rejected. But as long as it's done quickly, at least people know where they are. If they don't get an answer for 6 months and no clear person to go to, they'll just go and do their own thing. So any attempt for people to collaborate and play nicely in this space is balked unless you've got a methodology that will support it. And that probably, that might be partly led by industry, but I suspect it has to be something which at least is supported in the round. It may not have to be run by government, but I suspect that the health sector, the health infrastructure has to support this in some fashion. Coupled with that, and we've talked about it already, is if you're going to have this agile clinical content definitions, which at least for some of us, certainly in the OpenEHR world, are down to our persistence and querying definitions, that has to be tightly version controlled. And that will be exactly the same for FHIR resources. You need that kind of tight version control. So, some of the story of Handi is we tried to sell this idea to government in the UK about 6 months ago, and everybody said, yeah, that's right. And they made nice noises, but you could tell that people didn't really get it. You know, they still are kind of down the process of, we need open source, because open source is a big positive thing in the UK at the moment, from government, you know, top level government down. Everybody thinks open source is a good idea, but they're still kind of locked into, let's buy an open source product. Let's get Vista. Let's get OpenEYES. It's not. They're not really changing the environment. They're replacing one business model with another, but they're not actually supporting all the other SMEs. It's just another kind of lock-in. It's not quite as evil, but it's not far off it. So a few weeks ago, we sat down at a Handi meeting and said, well, what can we do about this? And I said, look, I think there are enough bits out there. There are enough, you know, open standards, open specifications that, while they're imperfect, will actually work in concert. And we can put something together to show people that it will work. Give a platform or a sandbox for people to play with. Let's construct what we've called an open platform demonstrator. We're not trying to say this is how it must be. We're certainly not trying to sell a commercial product or say this is, you know, Handi's official approach. We're just saying, look, somewhere in this mix of technologies, we think there is something interesting happening that we can support that kind of environment that we've talked about. So, here's an example. A little mobile app developer wants to plug in a care record, something to do with a Pulse app functionality. Maybe it's Apple with their new health kit thing that they announced yesterday. So, somewhere at the top, we've got the interoperability code toolkit. So this is the kind of, in an international arena, that's more likely to be IHE, CDS, IHE layer. You know, it's that kind of plumbing layer, I would call it. And then, you know, smart platforms, absolutely agree. Very nice visualizations plugin. It's a little immature at the moment, I would say, but I think it's the right way to go. And then I think we need something which is around the kind of size and simplicity that can be delivered by what Jan Mark showed, what Fabio showed, and obviously what's embedded in FHIR. Okay, simple, well-directed resources. They do what they say on the tin. It's an allergy, it's a blood pressure. It's not abstracted, it doesn't require developers to understand a reference model, whether it's OpenEHR or 13606. It's very, very simple. Now, by definition, that's going to be limited. You get that. You cannot have both. You can't get simplicity and flexibility. So you're compromising a little there. I think it's well worth compromising, and I think, you know, FHIR, whether it's hype or whether it's not, and I don't think it's all hype, you know, it's getting interest, it's getting traction in most countries in the world that I've been working in. And I would say, look, why don't we just fix on that, right? If we got smart on FHIR, why don't we support that as, you know, instead of our own little RESTful APIs? We might keep them, I'm not saying we keep them, but look, we can make big, big progress and start to get interesting things happening. It's not perfect, and it will, you know, has some way to go, but I think there's an interesting thing happening. Now, the place that I'm less comfortable about FHIR is where those content definitions come from, particularly as things goes on, and the more enthusiasm you get in this space, and I think there will be, the more demand there will be for new resources or profile resources, etc., etc. And that's the bit I'm a little uneasy about, and it's interesting, you'll have seen the blog from Graham Grieve that, you know, we're maybe getting a bit of interest. So my view, and it's mine, is we need archetypes, and I've said SNOMED. This is, you know, a UK perspective where SNOMED has enough traction that, you know, we should now be centering on that, and, you know, let's not bother with older legacy systems, legacy terminologies. And then at the bottom, in terms of this demonstrator platform, we've got, I've called OpenEHR in Viva Data Store. So that's what you've just seen from both Jan Mark and from Fabio, is one of these engines. So that's, if you like, our sweet spot of all the way down from a real system. Now, you don't have to have that. If you have a non-OpenEHR system, maybe a FHIR server, maybe it can work in this, or it should be able to work in the same space. It's using the FHIR resources, we hope defined, or at least certainly aligned with these archetype definitions. It's not going to be quite as rich as what you can do because of EQL, I would suggest, but it's still, you know, all part of that ecosystem. Has to be plugged into the clinical side, and this is where the OpenEHR methodology, at least the twin modelling methodology, starts to have a big bonus. So, as Fabio said, from the technical side, you just get on delivering that as seamlessly as you can, good performance, you know, nice visuals, all the things that clinicians want. but leave the clinicians to get on and sort out in this messy space. And when we've got this, we plug it in there. Okay, next steps. We're not using FHIR at the moment, but we want to. Okay, so we're kind of waiting for other people to do that. The Moran guys, as you say, have started that work. You know, the idea is that we should be supporting as many of the FHIR resources as we can. We want more OpenEHR providers, so I'll be talking to Jan Mark, the Ocean guys, anybody else who's building one of these OpenEHR backends, because we want to show that we can actually power this thing in a way that is vendor neutral, using the same AQL calls, hopefully using the same FHIR calls, and other, you know, we want to make this seamless.
What's in FHIR archetype?
Well, it's not that the FHIR archetype. What we're trying to do is to align the content of the FHIR archetype and the content of the FHIR resource and the content of the FHIR of the OpenEHR archetype. So, if you like, in our world, the OpenEHR archetype becomes a source of truth, and then it's possible to create a FHIR resource very easily from that. Now, that's a bit controversial, but that's. Yeah, I think the important thing is that's kind of how the CIMI world sees it. That's how Stan Huff in the US sees things, as it won't be OpenEHR in his world, but it will be clinical models that become the source of truth for FHIR resources which sit under SMART. So whether you believe the OpenEHR story or not, I think that's the message that people are starting to get in the US. That's me.